And then just to say that we've kept in a couple of designated question and answer slots throughout the session, but would encourage you to put any questions you have in the chat box as you go through, or do feel free to raise your hand as well and ask a question if something springs to you whilst we're talking. That's absolutely fine. We don't need to stick to the designated sessions completely. So I'll just get started then and quickly talk us through what we'll cover today, and then I'll hand over to Matt to share a few words as well. So I'm going to start with providing a quick introduction to ShareAction and the concept of the finance system and what we mean when we're referring to the finance system and the investment system. And then I'll move on to explain why we see AGM activism as being a really impactful campaigning strategy, and I'll refer to some examples of impact that we've witnessed ourselves along the years that we've been using this strategy to engage with companies. And then the second half of the session will be focused a bit more on some of the practical elements to bear in mind when attending AGM. So we'll explore what's involved in preparing to go to one, what you can expect on the day, and we'll provide a bit of advice on things like drafting AGM questions, should you feel inspired to go to an AGM yourself and ask a question at some point down the line. And then if we have chance at the end, I'll also briefly touch on another campaign strategy that's connected to AGM season as well, which is filing shareholder resolutions, just to kind of complete the circle and touch on that very briefly. But before we dive in, I will just hand over to Matt to say a few words of introduction as well. So over to you, Matt.
Great. Well, I think probably most of us here are familiar with Just Money Movement, but for the sake of the recording as well, let me just say a few words about us and why we're running this event. So at the Just Money Movement, our vision is for a world where money shapes a fairer, greener future, and we work on those issues from a Christian perspective. That means we touch on a range of different subjects, from tax justice to corporate responsibility to ethical banking. And within our banking work in particular, we have a few different ways that we try to push for change in this sector. So we have our Money Makes Change program, which is all about practical advice for individuals using their money with their banking, their pensions, their investments, savings, etc. We also are running a couple of campaigns encouraging people to switch, so the Big Bank Switch for individuals, as well as the upcoming Bankwell campaign focusing on church accounts, as well as the Greener, Fairer Banking Guide, which assesses the options that are available for churches. And what we are trying to do is kind of build a grassroots mass movement of switching happening that builds kind of consumer pressure and shareholder pressure at the same time at the higher level through engaging with AGMs. And we've done that the last few years. We own some shares ourselves, but we also aim to coordinate people who have shares in other companies to attend and convene faith leaders as well to be spokespeople at these kinds of events. The last thing to mention, which I'll come to at the end, is our network of Just Money champions. This event is marketed as a champions training event. Champions are our most engaged, supportive volunteers that we coordinate and resource and provide training like tonight to help them act for the fairer, greener world. And if I can just briefly, there's a lot of text on this slide, but I won't spend long on them. This just situates tonight's training in the context of what the Just Money Movement has been doing with the banks. So last year in 2024, together with all these organizations whose logos are represented here, we formulated a statement of concern addressed to HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, NatWest, and Santander, expressing concern from the churches that these banks were continuing to fund fossil fuel expansion and that there weren't any good options from a kind of customer service point of view for churches who wish to bank ethically. The smaller banks weren't offering the kinds of accounts that churches need with all their specificities, but the larger banks were continuing to fund climate breakdown. And if we can move to the next slide. We coordinated this letter, which was signed by over 70 organizations, got coverage in the Times and various other media. And the next slide, please. We also got responses from 4 out of the 5 banks that we named in that letter. And this slide basically just says that there was a range of detail in their responses, shall we say. So as part of following up from this email communication that we've had with each of the banks, we are hoping to attend, at the very least, the HSBC AGM happening in London, but potentially through coordinating champions and volunteers, one or two others as well, so we can follow up on this communication in person, address questions to the board, have the kind of public accountability that this process is for. I'm going to end my summary there and pass back to Bethany to take us into some of the detail of how we might actually do that AGM engagement.
Great, thanks, Matt. That was super helpful summary to set the scene. And now I'll kick off this section by introducing ShareAction very briefly for those that don't know much about us yet, and talk a bit about the concept of the finance system as well. Really just to set the scene for explaining why we think we should all be entitled to having a voice in this space, and why we think it's important that we're holding companies accountable for a range of decisions and actions that they're making. And we'll tie this into all of the brilliant work that Matt's talking about as well, and show how it can have application there. So just to very briefly introduce ShareAction, for those that aren't already familiar with us, ShareAction is a responsible investment campaigning organisation, and our vision is a world where the financial system serves our planet and its people. We've got 4 main goals that we kind of action in working towards this, but it's the 4th goal that's in bold here on the slides, that the investment system is diverse and inclusive at all levels. That's particularly pertinent to our conversation today. We're really eager to make sure we're involving a diverse range of voices in the work that we do alongside the public to try and leverage change, particularly when we're talking about different shareholder activism techniques. And this is really because we believe that the whole finance system should be listening to the voices of everybody that funds it and everybody that is affected by it, which is all of us. It's all members of society. And so that's why we think it's so important that we should kind of all have a role to play in shaping how well the finance system is working. I suppose we're probably all conscious that it's maybe not working as it should at the moment to be the best it can for people and planet. So there's a few things that we're doing to try to change what we call the kind of current status quo. And at the moment, ShareAction is utilising various levers within the financial system to try and drive change at major companies and finance institutions on a range of thematic issues, but including in 4 main categories: climate, nature, low pay, and health as well. And in campaigning on all of these subjects, we're adopting 4 main strategies that we find are really effective when they're applied in combination with one another. I won't go into lots of depth here in the interest of time, but we essentially have kind of 4 different ways of working. One being research. We carry out lots of rankings and benchmarks on a host of topics where we analyse the performance and behaviours of companies and financial institutions as well, and report on how well they're doing on things like the climate and biodiversity commitments. Alongside this, we engage lots of different investors and use the research that I've just spoken about to encourage those investors to, in turn, carry out effective engagements with their investee companies. We work a great deal on the policy front as well, and this is very much intertwined with all of our thematic campaigns too. So advocate for changes in the governance systems at both the UK and EU level, and relate this back to the research and the engagement work that we do as well. And then finally, the point that's most applicable today is really the corporate facing campaigns that are ongoing at ShareAction. And this is really where shareholder activism comes in a big way. And I'll return to talk about how this all links up in just a second. So that was a quick introduction to who ShareAction is, but we thought now would be a good time to also provide a very fundamental introduction to the finance system as well, just to provide some context as to why it's really important that we're getting involved in this space. So wanted to start with a very quick activity just to get people thinking about this. And it would be really interesting to hear what springs to mind for you when we refer to the finance system. So if any words are coming to mind, please just put whatever you think in the chat box. There aren't any right or wrong answers. Do feel free to put in anything you feel like, and just give you 30 seconds or so to do that. And also no problem if you don't feel too comfortable sharing anything right now. It's really just an exercise to kind of get people thinking about the finance system as potentially being something that's quite complicated. I can see Phoebe put murky. Yeah, exactly. A concept that's also a bit inaccessible, powerful. And what we try and demonstrate here is it can sometimes be a construct that's a bit difficult to understand and engage with. And we completely agree that it is complex, and the concept, yes, it is very much multifaceted, and that's evidenced slightly by this diagram that I've shown on the slides here. Something we find when we speak to individuals and other groups is that there is this feeling that something that makes the investment system so powerful is its mystery. So one thing we think is really important is to try and educate people on how they can interact with the finance system in really effective ways to try to demystify this concept and enable others to leverage change as well. But aside from its complexity and its power, another point I wanted to make here is that the finance system is something that we're all connected to in some way. And a lot of the time, we might not really realise the extent to which we are connected to a system that is so vast and so complex. So it could be through our savings or insurance packages or pensions or other institutions that we might be part of as well. Because a lot of the time, I suppose our money is being pumped through the system in ways we're not tracking and we're not realizing. For example, almost half of the money in the finance system is from our pension savings, and we're not always really clear on where it's going. And so this was all really just to demonstrate why, again, we think we should have a voice in this space. We've listed some quite big company names here in the middle image on the slide, and the point of including them is because some people are surprised to learn that we are probably all investing in the majority of these companies. So that's big tobacco firms, oil and gas majors, mining companies, big banks, big pharma. And we might be inadvertently funding many of the companies whose actions we don't necessarily agree with because our money isn't locked away, but it's kind of channeled through these companies and it's having really big impacts on the way the world around us is shaped. So I suppose with this context in mind, and because it's our money that's allowing these companies to operate, we think it's right that they be challenged by us and that we have a say in where this money is going. And I suppose alongside this, we know that the investment system is powerful, but it could be using its power in a good way and it could be building a better world. And that's really where AGM and shareholder activism comes in, because we try to encourage companies to use this money for the better and build the world that we want to see. So hopefully that helped set the scene a little bit. I'm now just going to provide a really, really quick whistle-stop tour through using shareholder activism before moving on more specifically to AGM activism. So I know that's why everyone is interested to hear about today. So on the slide here, we just wanted to provide a bit of a visual representation of how our corporate campaign strategy works, because it can be quite complicated and there are a lot of steps involved, but we find it's helpful to display it in a visual way. So when we are using shareholder activism as an engagement technique, it'll typically start with corporate campaign teams choosing target companies and the issues they'd like to challenge them on. Alongside this, we'll mobilise coalitions of investors that are really supportive of some of our asks and get them to join us in calling for some of the really key changes that we want to see. A typical first step would be for an investor coalition to sign a letter to the target company and asking them to make this change. If the company then gives an unsatisfactory response or no response, which unfortunately is quite often the case, the next step is for us to go to the AGM, question the company directly on the issue, and request that the company meet with us directly as well. And not only is this important for holding companies accountable, but we also find it's quite effective in setting examples for other investors to do the same. And often other investors present at AGMs might be more influential than us, hold more shares, and have a bit more power when it comes to making these asks. So we think it's really valuable if we are to be seen kind of putting really reasonable asks to companies and then taking them on board. It might create this ripple effect where more and more people are replicating this tactic and we are seeing the change. We want to see it at a much quicker rate. So it's kind of a multi-beneficial approach. So anyway, after we've asked the AGM question, the company might agree to meet with us. And in that follow-up meeting, hopefully we'll see the change or see a commitment that we've been asking for. But if not, then the final step and something of a escalatory action, you could say, is to go on and file a shareholder resolution at the target company, because this tends to build greater media attention and public scrutiny. And I'll explain a bit about what this is a bit later in the session. But now I'll just run through AGMs, and starting from the basics, just wanted to explain kind of what they are, why they're held, and then we'll talk through some of the practicalities of going to one in the second half of the session. But yes, just to start from the top, I suppose. So publicly listed companies, and that's any company listed on the stock exchange, are required to hold an annual general meeting where all of its shareholders can attend and participate and ask questions of the board. Usually a person is able to attend an AGM just by holding 1 or 2 shares in the company, and they often cost quite a nominal amount of money. It can vary from company to company, but usually the share cost itself is quite low. So people are often surprised at how accessible this is as a way to engage with companies directly. In terms of the AGM itself, it's a really key format for the company to provide a yearly update and reflection on things like its finances and policy changes, and other things like board and executive team elections. So it's, yes, kind of a unique time of year because it's the one moment where the company brings together all of the most influential decision makers, and they're present in the same room with members of the public as well, and kind of retail shareholders just owning 1 or 2 shares in the company. And this is something we try to take advantage of at ShareAction, and also teach other people on how to do this as well, because it is a really great and rare opportunity to hold a company accountable in quite a public setting. So at ShareAction, we'll typically hold shares in lots of the major companies on the London Stock Exchange and use them to enable other individuals or volunteers to ask questions on different social and environmental issues. So for example, in 2024, we asked just over 90 questions across 68 different companies, and probably looking to do something similar this year. So I guess that's a bit about what an AGM is and why they're held. But really what's important, I think, is to explain about how this can be such an impactful way to engage. And over the many years that we've been attending AGMs, we've found that asking questions of companies in this public setting is particularly powerful for a number of different reasons. I suppose one key reason for this, and I've alluded to this already, is that attending an AGM grants a level of access that you wouldn't find in traditional forms of campaigning. It does create this opportunity to have a direct line, a one-to-one line of contact with the people that do have a lot of power to change a company's behaviour and really influence decisions that are being made and that have huge impacts on the world around us. I think in addition to having this direct line of contact, we can also use this opportunity to ask a question to really stand out. And that's because when you go to an AGM, typically there won't be many people in the room asking questions, that there'll be probably 1 or 2 here and there, maybe speaking a bit more on the finance side. But it does mean that when you go along and ask a really well-researched and compelling question, it does come across as a much more engaging way to challenge the behaviour of a company and influence others to follow suit as well. And it does make us stand out a little from the rest of the kind of shareholder crowd. In combination with this, I think the public setting of the AGM is really helpful in holding a company accountable, and that's particularly so when your questions are framed to be quite constructive and quite respectful, which is generally the approach we'll take. We do find that companies find it quite difficult to refuse what we think are really reasonable asks. For example, if it's meeting with us afterwards, particularly when we put these asks to the companies in front of other shareholders as well. So we're really trying to make the most of this moment. And finally, I suppose just to say that going to AGMs and asking questions of the companies tends to be really pivotal moments in our campaigns. So often, as I mentioned before, we'll go to an AGM when we've been trying to secure some private dialogue with the company and it hasn't been yielding much progress. But we do find that this is a really key opportunity to secure this for meetings and kind of lead on to build a relationship that brings us benefits for years down the line. So lots of wins to be had, I would say, from going to an AGM and trying this campaign tactic out. I'll just go on to the next slide. And I mentioned before, but another really key aspect of our AGM work is the work that we do in collaborating with other groups that are external to our own campaigns, because it is one of our real beliefs that we should be platforming the voices of other individuals in this space as well, and particularly those that might have been directly impacted by a company's actions or decisions and might not necessarily have the opportunity to hold that company accountable otherwise. So on this slide, I've just included a few examples of some media and social pieces produced by groups and individuals we've supported to access AGMs in the last year or so, just to kind of demonstrate the spread of different issues that can be brought at AGMs. I won't go into lots of depth on this now, just in the interest of time, but as we've spoken through in the chat, we will share the slides afterwards and you can click through the links here to have a look at some of these stories if you're interested in doing that. So that was kind of setting the scene and talking a bit about the impact that's possible from going to AGMs. I will pause here just for a couple of minutes in case anybody has any questions they'd like to raise at this point, and then we'll go on to talk through kind of the practicalities of going to AGMs. So maybe if I stop there and if anyone would like to raise their hand or ask a question in the chat, please do feel free. Phoebe, if you want to jump in.
Just to clarify, to make sure I heard right. So does ShareAction have shares in various companies and then kind of outsource it to a community of people who can go along to the AGMs?
Yes, that's right. So essentially, over the years that we've been using AGM activism as a campaigning strategy, we've targeted a range of different companies. So we've acquired one or two shares in them, and we don't necessarily still engage with them as part of our own campaigns, but we hold on to the shares just in case we come across any communities or groups that are hoping to access these AGMs, and then we'll kind of enable that access by lending the shares to other people so that they can go and campaign and speak on the issues that are important to them and that they're working on. But alongside that, we do also involve members of the community and individual supporters in asking questions that relate to our own campaigns as well. But yes, that is one of the kind of pieces of support that we provide, is that we can help people to get into AGMs so they don't have to purchase shares themselves. So if there are any companies you're interested in engaging, or if you're in touch with anyone who is, do feel free to get in touch and ask whether we own shares in a company, and we can help facilitate that if we do have some available.
Yeah, amazing. That's so clever. Is there like a database somewhere that says how the companies you're in, or is it a kind of like I should get in touch thingy?
I'm afraid we don't have that publicly available, but please do feel free to get in touch. My email will be on the last slide, and I can share that afterwards. So yeah, you're very welcome to just come and ask.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, just thought I'd add onto that as well. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but part of what we're doing at Just Money Movement around AGM season is a similar thing. basically, we don't have quite as many shares as ShareAction do, but we do have holdings for banking in Lloyds and HSBC, which we're focusing on with our campaigning this year, but also in a range of other companies. So some supermarkets, mining companies, Shell, etc. A lot of that is kind of legacy from our past as the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility when we used to do more of this stuff. But yeah, if it's of interest to you personally, or maybe you're thinking about SCM networks, then we'd definitely be up for maybe following up on email later about if we might be able to help in the same way. So,
Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Phoebe, for asking that question. James, would you like to jump in?
Thanks, Bethany. Yeah, James Buchanan. I work for Laudato Si movement. We work closely with Just Money on particularly on banks, around banks financing of fossil fuels. Yeah, my question, well, a couple of parts to it, and you might come on to this later, so feel free to come back to it if that's the case. I wondered in relation to the different sectors that you ShareAction are sort of engaging with. Have you found, I don't know, that particular sectors, particular types of companies have been more responsive to engagement than others? Be interested to hear your feedback on that. And specifically in relation to banks, I wondered whether bank AGM dates are already published or if we're still waiting for those for this year. And yeah, if there's any sort of particular, hopes or key issues or whatever that you expect to come up at the bank AGMs this year.
No, thanks, James. Some great questions there. I'll maybe just start with the first point you made just about AGM dates and things, just to say that some like big bank AGMs dates have been confirmed, and in a few slides from now we've put a couple of the details on the slides to share with you. And I'll talk a bit about timelines and kind of when we can expect other dates to be announced. But I suppose just to go back to your first question on whether we see certain sectors or even certain banks being a bit more receptive to our asks than others. I would certainly say we do see a variety of responses to the asks that we bring at different AGMs. Wouldn't necessarily say there's a sector by sector pattern as such, but we have found that organising different actions around AGMs can have a bit more impact than simply just asking a question. So, for example, last year at some of our really high priority bank AGM targets, some of the French banks like Crédit Agricole, BNP Paribas, we tried to involve other techniques such as convening a group of investors to draft a statement, and we would share that at the AGM and incorporate that into our AGM question. And that seemed to have a bit more sway than just simply having one member of the team go along and ask the question. And we did feel that we were getting more substantive responses from companies when we were using different approaches like this and demonstrating widespread backing of our asks, particularly from an investor audience. So I'd say that's maybe something to be aware of. I suppose another a kind of factor that determines the success rate or receptiveness to our asks is also related to kind of how high bar or low bar the ask itself is, of course, which seems probably common sense. But for example, when our campaigns are at a slightly earlier stage, and what we're really trying to get out of going to an AGM is just a meeting with a company or a commitment that they'll speak with us again at a later date. Of course, we do tend to see a lot of companies kind of agreeing to that ask and taking that on board. It might be a few years down the line when we're asking companies to make a really big policy commitment or a big change and a big public commitment where we see a bit more resistance. And that's because obviously what we're asking them to do in the public eye is much more than just having a private meeting with us. So I wouldn't say necessarily a sectoral pattern, but rather relating to the types of asks we're bringing with our AGM questions. And that's why we consider some of the more escalatory actions like shareholder resolutions when we feel we've kind of reached a point where we won't yield much more progress. So hopefully that helps somewhat. Yeah, great. Thank you, though. There's some great questions there. I might, in the interest of time, move us on. We'll have some more room for questions at the end. So I'll just go on to the next slide. We're now going to talk through some of the practicalities involved in attending AGMs, in case you should be inspired to kind of try your hand at this, and just to give a bit of a lowdown of what's involved. I will actually stop sharing my screen at this point because we thought we'd introduce the second half of this section by sharing what an AGM experience can really be like. And we've got a video to play that was recorded by Sarah, the director of Just Money Movement. So I'll stop there and I'm going to let Matt take over the screen sharing. Ooh. Hopefully that's okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah and I'm the director of the Just Money Movement, and I've been asked to say a little about our experience of attending AGMs and how we use AGM activism as part of our campaigning. Just Money Movement has held shares in a number of companies over the years for the purposes of shareholder engagement and attending AGMs on a whole range of social and economic justice issues. And in recent years, we've been campaigning for a fairer, greener banking system. So our AGM work has focused on banks and how their investments harm people and planet through investing particularly in single-use plastics and in fossil fuels. For example, we attended HSBC's AGM in 2023 and again in 2024 to raise concerns from Christians and churches who were supporting our Don't Bank on Plastics campaign, calling on HSBC to end financing of single-use plastics. So the AGM was part of a wider campaign and lobbying effort. On the day, we also met with our activists to pray together and to protest. And later on, a few months later, we held a meeting with senior HSBC officials to express our concerns in more detail. In terms of the experience of going to an AGM on the day, they are a really important opportunity for civil society to speak directly to the leadership of some of the biggest banks and companies in the world. I would say be prepared, have your question well prepared in advance, listen and learn from others, and we really appreciate hugely the expertise and experience of ShareAction, both in the training but also in helping individuals and smaller charities to prepare and attend AGMs. And find out as much as you can beforehand, particularly about the process of submitting questions, to give yourself the best chance of being able to ask your question and be heard fully. On both occasions, particularly at last year's HSBC AGM, question time was cut quite short. Some people didn't have the opportunity to ask their question. So find out then what's the follow-up mechanism. Is there a way, for example, to submit your question on email instead? And the other thing I'd say to remember is that AGMs are a tool for campaigners to use, one tool amongst many. So depending on what issue you're passionate about, find out what else is going on, what other campaigning groups are doing on this, and just make sure that your question fits in within that wider strategy of how we seek to influence these banks and companies to bring about change for good.
Great, thanks very much for playing that, Matt. I will just share my screen again and take us through some of the practicalities of attending AGMs. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. And you'll have heard Sarah mention a couple of the things that I'm about to speak to as well, but I thought I'd just take us through a few pieces of advice on kind of how to prepare, things we should be thinking about before the AGM. We'll display some of the bank AGM dates and then talk through expectations for the day and other actions you can consider afterwards as well. So just, I suppose, to start with preparations ahead of the AGM then, a question was asked earlier on AGM dates, which is great because we're going to speak about this now, but just some tips on kind of identifying AGM dates. I would say something to get into a good habit of is checking a company's financial calendar at regular intervals for confirmation of the exact date. But as a general rule of thumb, a company's AGM will typically fall within the equivalent week of the year prior. So if you can find that exact date and kind of make a note for the next year, you'll have a bit of a kind of period of time to aim towards. And that's usually a really good indication of when the AGM will take place. The company will then publish what's called an AGM notice, usually about 4 to 6 weeks ahead of the AGM, and that publication will set out the exact time, the date, the location, and the format of the meeting as well. When I say format, I just mention that because not every AGM is held in person only, but some companies hold their AGMs online, or some hold it in hybrid format, giving you the option to kind of join virtually and speak or submit your question in writing rather than be present in the room. When the AGM notice is published, we'd also recommend having a kind of quick scan through that just to check if there are any additional attendance requirements, and that might be something like registering your intention to attend in advance with the company. They can sometimes request that happens if they're expecting a large number of shareholders to turn up on the day. So really good to be aware of what's expected. I suppose another point to make, we touched on this before when speaking about shareholdings, but of course, to be able to attend the AGM, you'll need to acquire a share in the company, either by borrowing one from a current shareholder, purchasing one yourself if you're in a position to do that and interested in doing that. And when you've kind of borrowed a share from somebody, you'll just need a document that sets out your eligibility to attend and participate in the AGM too. And you'll show that when you get to the AGM venue. Sarah spoke to this, but ahead of time, it's also really great to have the AGM question prepared and have practiced reading it through a few times so that you're really familiar with the wording, you feel comfortable with the phrasing that you've decided to use, so that you just come across as clearly and confidently as you can on the day, and so that if you have an opportunity to speak with members of the company, either within the Q&A section or outside of that section, you're able to kind of speak through your question and be quite eloquent with the point you're trying to get across. So just good to be prepared on that front as well. And then the final kind of tip from us in preparing ahead of the AGM is that it's usually a good idea to do a bit of extra research about a kind of recent news stories around the company, just in case anything that they've been involved in recently could be brought into the response to your AGM question. So just be aware of kind of everything that's going on in the company's kind of recent activities. Again, just so you feel as prepared as possible when going into that meeting, and you can kind of plan for things that they might say in response to your question, and maybe have some rebuttals prepared if you feel confident doing that. So there's just a few things to bear in mind before the AGM. On this slide, as I mentioned before, we've just included some of the dates and the locations for UK bank AGMs coming up over the next couple of months, in case there are any on this list that you're considering attending. As you can see, some companies haven't yet confirmed their location. Some have dates, but they don't yet have times. But all of this information we're expecting to be released in the next couple of weeks. So we should know more about this soon. But yes, just listed the kind of 5 kind of biggest UK banks on here. There are, of course, other international banks as well that we're kind of monitoring as well. So do get in touch if you are interested in hearing about any other bank AGM dates coming up. But yes, as I said, we'll share the slides afterwards, so you'll have all of this to hand. I'll now quickly run through some expectations for the day itself. Firstly, in terms of timings, we always recommend trying to arrive at the AGM about half an hour before the official start time, and this is just so that you have plenty of time to register your attendance before you enter the meeting venue. When you reach the registration desk at the AGM, it's usually a good idea at this point to ask about the process for asking the AGM question once you're inside. More often than not, it's really simply just a case of raising your hand during the Q&A section of the meeting, but sometimes the company might ask you to register your question at the desk or somewhere else in the room, and they might ask you to leave a copy of your question with them as well. So for this reason, we'll always suggest taking at least two printed copies of the question with you so that you've got one to hand in and one to read from during the meeting itself. And we say printed copies just because some companies can have kind of restrictions and rules on using your phone and things like that, so wouldn't rely on being able to access it anywhere else. So once you've registered your attendance, you'll be able to make your way into the meeting room and find a good seat where you can be seen and heard when you come to say your question. If it's a larger meeting, it can sometimes be a good idea to sit near the end of a row, so you can quite easily be passed a microphone, or sit close to the front of the room so you can make eye contact with the board when you're speaking. That can just make you come across as being a bit more engaging. So that's something we say to the volunteers that go along to ask questions on our behalf as well. And then in terms of what you can expect from the meeting itself, the running order can differ from company to company, and we can't always predict exactly how it will go. But generally, meetings are typically split into three main sections. They'll usually start with a presentation and updates from the chairman, and other members of the board might speak at this point as well. And they'll probably share an overview of the financial performance from the previous year and speak about any key changes to be aware of and key things coming up over the year ahead. After the presentation section and the speeches at the beginning, this is usually when the question and answer section will follow, which is when you would raise your hand to ask your question. And then finally, the meeting will typically end with time for voting on shareholder proposals put to the company or filed by the company themselves as well. So that will usually signal the close of the meeting. And then finally, just to say, after the formal part of the meeting has ended, there is usually an opportunity to kind of stick around and mingle with both company representatives and other shareholders. And as Sarah mentioned in the video, this can be a good time to chat with other campaigners as well, or other people trying to engage on important issues. So just to say that this can be a really key time to find out other pieces of information, either from the company themselves or find out what other organisations are up to, and it can make your presence a bit more memorable as well if you are comfortable kind of speaking and mingling with members of the company. So we do encourage people to do this if they're happy to. Obviously no obligation to if you're not comfortable, but yeah, that's kind of can be quite a key part of the day. So that's generally what to expect at the AGM. And then we've just pointed out a couple of kind of tips on things you can consider after the AGM has come to an end. So these are a few things that we try to think about at ShareAction. So we'll consider different follow-up campaign actions beyond just asking the question. We might think how we can refer back to that moment in some other digital actions perhaps, or in our comms. We'll try to spread the word a bit about the intervention that we've had at the AGM, and we try and do that in ways that really highlight the voices of the people who were involved. So we might have some of our supporters recording a video of themselves and speaking about their motivations for getting involved at the AGM and sharing a quick summary of what happened afterwards. And that can be quite an engaging way of telling the story on social media and with public audiences, or even with media as well. I spoke to this before, but something we often ask for is for a meeting to discuss the issue at hand directly with the company too. So direct engagement is usually something we're considering after the AGM. And we also try to be quite conscientious of kind of taking notes of everything that happened during the AGM, so that when we start planning ahead for next year, we can refer back to key things that the members of the company might have said, or commitments they might have made during one of their speeches or one of their more informal conversations with us, so that we can kind of come back to that at a later point and use it just to add more credibility to our engagements and arguments. So these might be things you'd like to consider as well. Then there are a whole host of other things you can do around AGMs as well to add more impact. I was just going at this point to share a bit of insight on one element of going to AGMs, which is how we draft compelling AGM questions and try and get the target company to really listen to our asks. So just quickly talk through some tips relating to this. So I suppose just in terms of providing a bit of general advice on drafting AGM questions, I think maybe the most key takeaway or the most important thing to consider when getting started on writing an AGM question of your own is to really bear in mind the overall ambitions for your interaction and what it is you'd like to achieve by going to the AGM. Of course, a general piece of advice is to try to make the most of the engagement opportunity and the time that you have in the room, but you might also find it quite helpful to think through what you'd like to get from the company in response to your question. So is it that you're looking for further dialogue at this point, or are you looking for a verbal commitment or a response to a human impact story that you've shared? So all of this can be quite kind of key things to consider when drafting your question, because it's always good to refer at the end or at some point in the question to quite a tangible ask that you can monitor whether the company kind of comes through on. So yes, just kind of good to bear that in mind when framing your question. I suppose in terms of the length of the question, at ShareAction we do try to strike a balance between keeping the question concise enough to retain the interest of the shareholders and the board, but also we want to make sure we're capturing all the really key elements that we'd like to get across to the company whilst we have this moment in the room with them. As a general rule of thumb, we'll try to keep our questions under 3 minutes in length, and that's not rushing through the question, speaking it slowly and clearly. And we find that is kind of a good period to aim for. Of course, quite a lot of our questions are shorter, but we try not to go over that 3 minute duration. We do find that some companies that maybe are expecting quite a lot of interaction at their AGMs as well can sometimes put a time cap on how long people have to speak. So another reason to try to keep questions concise if you can. I suppose another few pieces of advice, and one is just to try to use quite a clear and respectful tone. Oh, this is at least something we try to do. Our engagement tactic isn't to disrupt AGMs or present ourselves as being too confrontational, but we're trying to encourage progress and constructive dialogue going forwards. And I suppose in conjunction with this, we're quite conscious of the audience in the room, so we're trying to write out AGM questions in a language that the company and the shareholders can relate to. So we might try and refer to the financial risk relating to the topic that we're engaging on, and put it, like, make sure the phrasing is in words that they can relate to as well. So again, just a few things that might be helpful when drafting your own statements. And then referred to this earlier, but yes, just really good to include quite a clear ask in the AGM question as well, so that you can track whether the company's kind of following up on that or not. And then in terms of the structuring of our questions, I've put an example question on the screen here. Appreciate the text is quite small, so sorry if you can't read that very clearly, but we will share it afterwards. But I suppose this mainly is just to demonstrate how we tend to structure our questions. So most of our AGM questions tend to be part statement, part question. We'll start with a really clear introduction, and we'll set out some context and then have a clear ask at the end. This is an example question from Barclays AGM last year, which was focusing on fracking, and we were kind of also referring to testimonies and stories that have been shared with us by communities that are on the front lines of fracking operations as well. And we thought that kind of speaking to this within the contextual part of the AGM question was quite a powerful way of demonstrating the importance of this ask. You'll see also at the end that we kind of backed up our ask with reference to how many other people are supporting this by signing on to a letter, which again was just adding this other kind of element of conviction for the question here. But yes, I think really something that's really key for us is to have a well-structured question and include some really key bits of context in the middle there. So I'll move us on. As I said, we'll share the slides afterwards. We thought at this moment, we've only got 5 minutes or so left, but just would like to invite you, if you are interested in doing so, and just dropping any ideas you have for AGM questions in the chat box. Won't discuss them now, just in the interest of time, but do feel free to put down any ideas that you're having as well. And we'll move on to the last bit. I guess pause there as well. I can see there is one question from Phoebe in the chat about purchasing a share. First, when you buy a share, is it a one-off payment or do you give money regularly? Typically, it will be a one-off payment to buy a share. We'll typically use a couple of UK brokers that we have charitable accounts with, and the share price will be listed on the online platform, and it's just a one-off purchase, and then we can use that share either to nominate somebody else to attend an AGM on that holding or to attend ourselves, but we won't continually pay for it. If you have an account with a broker, you may have to pay kind of a fee to have the account itself, and that might be an ongoing payment, but the share would usually just be a one-off. Great, thank you. I'll keep moving on just in the interest of time, because we're almost at the end of the hour. But any questions we don't get to, I'm sure we can come back to by email afterwards. So at this point, I was just going to really quickly mention another corporate engagement tactic that is connected to AGM season that I referred to at the beginning, and that is filing a shareholder resolution. Just to quickly explain what this is, it's maybe self-explanatory by the name, but a shareholder resolution is a proposal put forward by a group of shareholders, which asks the company to take a specific action. Then the proposal itself, if it passes the threshold, is voted on by all the shareholders at a company's AGM. Mentioned this earlier, but we use this as an escalation tactic when prior meetings and direct communications with the company haven't been yielding the progress we want to see. They are a bit more confrontational. They'll often draw significant media attention, and companies do want to avoid that if possible in most cases. So that does mean that sometimes the threat of filing a resolution is enough to prompt the action we're asking for, and sometimes the company will kind of agree to our asks before we've even reached the AGM just by us threatening this tactic, in which case we'll sometimes withdraw the resolution itself, and just hope the company to make sure it's kind of agreeing to and continues to live with its commitments. Here's a couple of just kind of news clips and media clips from different resolutions we've facilitated or supported over the last couple of years as well. So I'll just share those, and you can click through the links to see them properly when we share the slides. And on this slide, I've just included a couple of kind of bigger wins that we've seen over the years that we've been using shareholder activism to engage on a variety of different thematic topics. I won't talk through them now because we're almost at time, but just to provide a few examples of the kind of range of different things we've been working on and using this tactic for. And I think I will stop there and I'll pass back to Matt to talk through the last section. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, great. We've not got loads of time, so maybe if we could skip forward 2 slides. I just want to say a few words about the Just Money Champions Network, but first I just want to say thank you so much to Bethany for all of that brilliant information, so informative. I could probably ask about 10 different questions in response now. I don't know about the rest of you. So thank you very much for that. As I said earlier today, this training and Just Money Movement's wider AGM campaigning is part of our broader package for Just Money Champions, our high-level engaged volunteers, helping us to build a movement of Christians engaged across the UK, working for a fairer, greener future. And maybe your thing, because you've come tonight, is something around corporate responsibility or ethical banking or shareholder engagement specifically, or maybe you're interested in all sorts of other issues. Maybe your thing is actually theology or tax justice or poverty and inequality. Basically, we're here to help you harness what you're interested in. Sorry, if you can move on to the next slide as well. Just to briefly sum up what's going on for champions at the moment. There's ongoing regular support that was listed on the previous slide, but you can see what's coming up. So we've got this training and this AGM campaign at the moment. We do a bi-monthly kind of social drop-in where we'll discuss something in the news, maybe something from scripture, pray together, meet together, chat, very informal. And then coming up later in the year, in June, we have Fair Tax Week, where we're planning to run some training on kind of tax policy 101, which should be really helpful and useful for campaigning in that area. And then, yeah, we have these two campaigns ongoing that we're mobilizing champions to get involved with. So the AGM campaigning that we've mentioned already, but then we also have a campaign called Bankwell with the Just Love Network, which is all about reaching out to influential churches in the UK about their own bank accounts, with the aim of sparking a movement of churches that switch, and kind of all feeds into this broader stuff that we've already been talking about tonight. Okay, we're at 7 o'clock, but if we could just have the next slide. If you're at all interested in joining us as a champion, if that's something that you've been exercised by this evening, then please do consider signing up at this webpage, or you can scan that QR code with your phone. The role is very much open for you to interpret and use however is useful to you. There's not a strict kind of commitment of time or effort. We just want to be able to resource you and help you and connect you to others who might share that passion. So if you've been at all interested in what we've discussed tonight, then I'd encourage you to scan that code, go to that website, or equally send me an email, which I'll put in the chat, and we can have a conversation about what getting involved with Just Money Movement might look like for you. Lastly, just to say, on the particular theme of the AGM campaigning, I'm aware that some of you may be planning to attend AGMs individually as shareholders. But as I mentioned earlier, Just Money does have shares, and we are planning to go at least to HSBC, or if you're based near or willing to travel to Edinburgh for Lloyd's, then do let me know, because we'd love to coordinate some effective advocacy at those banks. But equally, if you're planning to attend a bank AGM that isn't HSBC or Lloyd's, then I'd also really love to hear about what you're thinking and planning, and whether we might be able to work together on that at all and give you some support. Okay, I think all that's left to do is to say again, thank you so much to Bethany for that. We'll send the slides and the recording round afterwards. And thank you all for joining us this evening, giving up a bit of your time. Yeah, we'll be in touch, and have a great rest of your evening.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Thanks everyone for joining us. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.